All right, so today we are taking a deep dive into something that's pretty close to a lot of our hearts, I think. The Little Way of St. Thérèse of Lisieux. And we've got her autobiography, Story of a Soul, to help us out.
Right.
But we're going to try to see it through a slightly different lens today.
Okay.
We're going to look at Jane Bennet
Oh, interesting.
from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice.
Okay, I see where we're going.
And kind of see, how does her very quiet life, how does that actually fit in with this idea of the little way?
Interesting.
So for people who might not be as familiar with it, with the little way, what is so compelling about it? Especially for, I think, a lot of us.
Well, I think what's so captivating about it is its simplicity.
Right.
Instead of these huge acts of, sacrifice or grand gestures, it's really about focusing on trust and humility and love in the smallest of actions, right? And, this idea, she talked about a little way, very short and very straight, a little way that is wholly new. And this idea of having this really deep trust in Jesus, right? Like a child being held in their parents' arms.
Right.
And that's actually that beautiful image from Proverbs, right? Whoever is little one, let him come to me.
Right.
So it's this deep trust in God.
It's interesting because you think about a child in their parents' arms.
Right.
They're totally dependent.
Right.
And it's kind of like she's saying, we need to kind of have that same sort of attitude towards God.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. A recognition of our own weakness.
Right.
And our limitations and surrendering to that love. And, she talks about how that even spills over into the most simple of tasks, right?
Right.
She says, I do not have the strength to perform great actions.
Right.
But I want all that I do, no matter how trivial, to be done out of love.
And that's so interesting to think about because, I think a lot of us, we get caught up in, am I doing enough? Am I praying enough? Am I, serving enough?
Yeah.
And she's just saying, hey, just do little things.
Yeah.
But do them out of love.
Right.
And it changes everything.
Yeah, and I think what's so awesome about that is this idea of even our weaknesses, even when we fall short,
Right.
Even when we fall asleep during prayer or something like that, we offer that up in that same spirit, right? We trust in God's mercy.
So it's really like kind of democratizing holiness.
Totally.
In a way. It's
Yeah.
like you don't have to be a spiritual superstar to be holy.
It's not about being a superstar.
Wow.
It's about that extraordinary love in ordinary moments, right?
Right.
And I love that because she even talks about, I think she refers to herself as like a little white flower or something like that in God's garden.
Yeah.
And she really took to heart what Jesus says in Matthew about becoming like a child, and she recognized that.
It's interesting because you also, you think about Ralph Martin. He talked about, the idea of weak offerings.
Yeah.
Like you're offering something, but it doesn't seem like a lot. And she believed, God can take those weak offerings and multiply them just like the loaves and fishes.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not about how much you do. It's about just giving what you can out of love.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that's such an encouraging message because, especially in our kind of world today, we're kind of taught, you got to hustle, you got to do more.
Yeah.
And it can be so exhausting.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
But she's just saying, hey, what if it was just more about trusting?
Right.
Yeah.
And she says, Jesus does not demand great actions from us, but simply surrender and gratitude.
And even to pick up a pin for love can convert a soul.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really saying, our littleness is not uselessness.
Right.
But, yeah, exactly.
For those who are feeling spiritually tired,
Yeah.
it's about trusting more, not doing more.
Yeah, that's so good.
Right.
So, it raises an interesting question for us. Like, how do we actually see that lived out?
Right.
In stories, in people that we know.
Right.
And that's where Jane Bennet comes in.
Right.
So if we think about Pride and Prejudice,
Right.
She's in this world where there's a lot of judgment.
A lot of judgment.
Yeah, a lot of judgment.
Yeah.
But she is this picture of just quiet, constant goodness.
Right.
Yeah,
she's not the one.
She's not flashy or anything like that.
No.
But her life, if you look at it through the lens of the little way, there's so much there that we can see.
Absolutely. So let's look at some of those kind of, I guess we could say, key parallels.
Yeah.
And I think the first one is this idea of trust in goodness and the refusal to judge harshly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like in Therese, she really believed in, even when she was hurt, choosing to see the best in people.
Right.
And to look at their actions charitably.
Yeah.
Almost like as an act of mercy, right?
Yeah.
And Jane is so interesting in this because, you think about how she interacts with Caroline Bingley, who is so clearly unkind to her.
Yeah.
Or how she deals with Mr. Darcy, who at first seems so arrogant.
Yeah.
But she's constantly looking for the best possible explanation for their behavior.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. It's like her naivety is actually a form of spiritual discipline almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's really easy to kind of look at that and be like, oh, she's just naive.
Yeah.
But when you kind of look at it through the little way,
Yeah.
you realize that it's actually this deliberate choice that she's making.
Right. It's not that she's blind to it.
Right.
She's choosing love and trust over suspicion.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not weakness.
Yeah. It's actually strength.
It's a spiritual strength rooted in humility, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's echoing Therese's choice to see with eyes of mercy.
Right. And that actually leads us to our second point, which is love and small things.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because for Therese, holiness wasn't about these big gestures. It was about all the little hidden acts of love and patience that we do every day.
Yeah.
And I think Jane is such a beautiful example of that because she's not someone who's, giving these big pronouncements or doing these big, acts.
Yeah, no heroic deeds or anything like that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's just in her quiet way of taking care of her family, of loving Bingley without being demanding.
Yeah, that's right.
Just being able to kind of, weather those misunderstandings or rejections without being bitter. Even when Bingley leaves and she's obviously heartbroken.
Yeah, she never has any outbursts or anything like that.
Yeah, think about how she acts.
Right.
Right. There's a sadness, but it's not, there's no public display of, self-pity or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's so powerful.
Yeah.
Because, I think, in today's world, it's kind of like if you're suffering, let everyone know about it.
Right.
But she was so strong.
Yeah, that quiet endurance is so powerful. It's just like Therese's image of picking up a pin for love.
Right.
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 Yeah.
And it's like this beautiful...
It's a spirituality of being present and loving in the ordinary, finding strength in gentleness, in constancy.
Right.
And, you see that inner strength shining through, even in that heartbreak.
And it makes me think, in our own lives, how much do we actually value that kind of quiet love?
Right.
Because our world is so loud.
Yeah.
Right.
That's true.
And everyone's always striving to achieve and to be seen and all this.
Yeah.
But Jane and Therese are both showing us something completely different.
It's a different path.
Right.
Yeah.
An interior strength.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which leads us to this next point, which is enduring suffering silently. Right. Therese, she experienced a lot of suffering, both physically and emotionally.
Yeah.
And she offered it up to God quietly without making a big fuss about it.
Right.
And Jane, too.
Yeah.
She carries her burdens with this quiet strength.
Yeah.
Especially, you think about after Bingley leaves.
Yeah.
Austen tells us that she had supported herself with such fortitude and patience.
Yeah, and it's interesting you contrast that with Elizabeth.
Right.
Right? Elizabeth's much more vocal about her distress.
Right.
But Jane accepts that heartache with this quiet strength.
And that's so little way.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like this interior suffering offered up in silence.
Yeah.
It's such a powerful thing.
It's a hidden path. Right.
Yeah.
It's a hidden path of offering love through the acceptance of pain without needing to draw attention to ourselves. And it's so different, I think, than how, sometimes suffering is kind of portrayed. Like, you need to be very vocal about it.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the final, I guess, comparison we could make is this idea of humility and simplicity. And Therese really believed in this idea of just being little, of being content to be small, and how only little children and the humble will enter the kingdom of God.
Yeah, she was so convicted about that.
And Jane, her whole demeanor is marked by humility.
Yeah, absolutely.
She never wants to be the center of attention.
Right.
She never wants to be praised.
Yeah, that's so true.
And even when she finally gets engaged to Bingley, who's such a good match for her,
Yeah.
she's almost, it seems like, surprised by her own happiness.
Yeah.
Like she doesn't really deserve it.
It's like she's not expecting it.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's so,
Yeah.
it's such a beautiful example.
She's so content with just being herself.
Right.
Yeah.
That lack of pride, that simple joy in other people's good fortune is so Therese.
It really is.
Right.
It echoes her understanding that God exalts the humble.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not that she's simple.
Mm-hmm.
Like she's not dumb or anything.
No, it's not a lack of intelligence. It's a freedom from that need for validation.
Right.
Yeah.
So central to the little way.
Yeah, she's so comfortable in her own skin.
Right.
She's not trying to prove anything to anyone.
Right.
Yeah.
And it makes me think, when we were talking about that image of the little flower earlier, she really is kind of like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gleaming quietly.
Yeah.
Not demanding attention.
Yeah.
Her beauty's just in her goodness.
And it's so interesting because, if you compare her to her sisters,
yes,
it really highlights, why she is such an example of the little way.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's start with Elizabeth.
Okay.
Because Elizabeth goes through this much more dramatic journey.
Yeah, right. It's like almost like a way of enlightenment for her. She goes through pride, misjudgment, and then there's this real turning point of self-awareness and conversion for her.
Right.
She has this great line when she reads Darcy's letter.
Right.
Till this moment, I never knew myself.
Right.
And it's almost like a dark night of the soul.
Right.
For her, And so she really has to struggle.
Right.
To have her love mature.
Right.
Whereas, with Jane, it seems like her love's already mature.
Right.
She's already kind of passed through that suffering.
Right.
Quietly.
Right. And it's so, so different.
It is, and it really highlights the difference, right?
Right.
The little way is not necessarily about these, big dramatic conversions. It's about this constant practice.
Right. Of love and really subtle.
Right. And then there's Mary.
Oh, yeah, Mary.
And Mary's kind of this, she's got that, what we could say is that way of false piety.
Oh, yeah.
It's all outward.
Yeah. Yeah, she's always got the quote ready or the observation.
Yeah. Right.
But it's missing that charity and warmth.
It's not genuine, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think Therese would look at that and say, that's kind of the big way.
Yeah, it's that perfectionism.
Right.
Yeah.
It's trying to rely on your own intellect or your outward displays of devotion, and not really about humility and love.
And remember, she said, despite my littleness, I can hope to be a saint.
Right.
So it's not about, having to be impressive.
Right.
Yeah, it's about that interior disposition.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you have Lydia.
Oh, my goodness.
Who's just like completely, she's on the way of the world.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Just complete vanity.
Yeah.
Pleasure-seeking.
Yeah.
Impulsive.
Yeah, no self-awareness whatsoever.
Right.
Yeah.
The broad road. Right.
Yeah, the antithesis of the little way.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I think what's interesting is to think about Kitty.
Mm-hmm.
Because Kitty's she's always in the background.
Yeah.
But I think she represents this other aspect of the little way.
Okay.
Which is that, Grace working quietly in a soul that's open to it. Right.
Yeah.
She's not hardened like Lydia.
Right.
But she's not like this outwardly perfect person.
Yeah, she's impressionable.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, Therese had this concept of little souls.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
These are the people who, maybe they don't have the strength to do these big things.
Yeah.
But they can be carried by grace.
Yeah.
If you're just open to it.
And Kitty's journey kind of speaks to that, doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
And, at the end of the book, Austen even tells us that her improvement was great, just by being in that better environment.
It wasn't like this overnight transformation or anything.
Right. It was just these small steps.
Just a little bit of better soil,
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think, when we think about, especially those of us who are in any sort of, position of spiritual guidance, that's such an important thing to remember.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not about forcing people.
Right.
It's just about
just gently encouraging.
Right.
Yeah.
And creating that environment for growth.
Yeah, that's so important.
And then we have, I think it's interesting to consider also Mr. and Mrs. Bennet.
Oh, yeah.
and how they relate to this.
Yeah.
Because Mr. Bennet, he's kind of this detached, ironic.
Yeah, he's very witty, right?
Yeah.
But there's this real detachment.
Detached, yeah.
Yeah.
He's not really virtuous.
Right.
But he's not openly, terrible or anything. He's just kind of like this.
He's lukewarm.
Lukewarm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that actually, thinking about the little way.
Right.
There's this need for participation.
Right. Right.
It's active. And his tendency to kind of observe from a distance while it provides some humor, right?
Right.
Ultimately, it represents a missed opportunity for love and guidance.
Right.
Therese said, what offends Jesus, what wounds his heart, is the lack of trust.
Right.
And so, in a way, his detachment could be seen as a lack of trust.
Right.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Bennet, she's just completely opposite.
Yeah, she's constantly scheming, trying to arrange these marriages.
Right. And it's all from anxiety and fear.
Yeah, completely the opposite of that trust and abandonment that's at the heart of the little way.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's so key because it really shows you that she's trying so hard to control.
Yeah.
But she's not trusting.
Right. And, Therese talked about how, it is confidence and nothing but confidence that must lead us to love.
Right.
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 Yeah.
And it's so interesting because, so many times in our lives, we operate out of fear.
Right.
Rather than trust.
Right. Yeah.
And then we have Bingley.
Yeah.
Who seems to kind of have this natural
Bingley's great.
Innocence and trust.
Yeah.
He's so calm.
He's humble, generous, kind of very open-hearted.
Yeah.
And he really embodies that childlike spirit that Therese valued so much.
Right.
Yeah.
He's not trying to be someone he's not.
Right.
And he's willing to,
admit when he's wrong.
Admit when he's wrong.
On change.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I think a lot of people, they kind of look at Jane and they say, oh, she's just a Pollyanna.
Mm-hmm.
But is that really fair?
Yeah. I think that's something we really have to address because, the idea of a Pollyanna is someone who's just naive and blind to, the negative aspects of reality.
Right.
But Jane, her choice to see the best in people.
Right.
It's not a denial of their flaws. It's a deliberate choice rooted in her deep faith. It's choosing love and trust even when it's easier.
Right.
Or maybe more justifiable to be cynical.
Right.
So it's not a weakness, it's a strength. Right. Yeah.
And it's so interesting because, if you look at some specific scenes where she's really put to the test, like, for example, when she's invited to Netherfield.
Right.
And then falls ill.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it's so clear that the invitation was manipulative. And she never complains.
No.
She never says a bad word about Caroline.
Yeah. And even though she's obviously uncomfortable, she doesn't complain.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's such a beautiful example.
Yeah. It illustrates that principle of Therese, who said, I have never sought anything but to please Jesus.
Right.
And even this has been a gift of his love.
Right.
So, even when she's uncomfortable, she focuses on love. Right. Acceptance.
Oh, yeah. And then when Bingley leaves.
Oh, man.
You know. And she's heartbroken.
Yeah.
But she doesn't, again.
Yeah.
There's no drama.
She
says she has no cause for repining.
Yeah, exactly.
And she defends Bingley and Caroline.
She doesn't assign any blame.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow.
Yeah. And Therese said, to suffer and be silent is the supreme lesson Jesus has taught us.
Right.
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 Yeah.
And so it's this beautiful example of mercy and humility.
Yeah.
Even though she has every reason to be hurt.
Yeah.
And to be upset.
Yeah.
And then she goes to London, hoping to see Bingley again.
Right.
And is just met with coldness.
Yeah.
And again, there's no bitterness.
Yeah. It's so interesting. It's like she gently goes after it, But when she's met with, opposition.
Right.
She resigns herself with grace.
Right. Yeah.